For more than 20 years, Thomas and Elaine had lived in a small wooden cabin at the edge of the forest. They were both in their late 60s now, settled into a quiet rhythm that suited them more than anything the busy world outside could offer. Their days were simple, steady, and predictable, exactly the way they preferred them. Most mornings began the same way. Thomas would step onto the porch with his old metal mug, letting the steam from his coffee rise into the cool air while Elaine tidied the small kitchen inside. From their front steps, they could see the tall pines stretching in every direction, their branches swaying gently as if greeting them. This forest had become more than scenery. It felt like a familiar neighbor, steady, comforting, and full of quiet stories they had learned to respect over the years. The forest had never frightened them. If anything, it felt protective. They understood the rhythms of nature, the calls of the birds, the rustle of small animals in the brush, and the distant groan of shifting branches after a windy night. But lately, Thomas had begun to notice something different. It wasn't dramatic, just a small change, subtle enough that he didn't mention it to Elaine at first. The woods were quieter, not silent, just less alive than usual. Fewer bird calls in the morning, less movement in the undergrowth. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath at times. Thomas told himself it was nothing unusual. Maybe a seasonal shift, he thought. Maybe animals were simply moving deeper into the trees. Still, the change lingered in the back of his mind. Steady and quiet, like a question waiting for an answer. He didn't know it yet. But the forest was preparing him, preparing them both. The first unusual sign appeared early one morning, just after sunrise. Thomas stepped outside with his coffee, expecting the usual crunch of needles beneath his boots and the distant chatter of birds. Instead, he noticed a set of impressions in the soil near the cabin steps. At first, he thought they belonged to a large animal, maybe a bear passing through in the night. But as he crouched down and traced the shape with his hand, he felt a quiet unease settle in. These weren't bear prints, they were longer, wider, and deeper. It looked almost like a human footprint, but far too large to belong to any person he'd ever known. Thomas didn't call Elaine outside. He simply stood there for a moment, looking at the pattern, and then straightened his back. He had lived in the woods long enough to know when something didn't fit the usual pattern. Later that afternoon, their old dog, Scout, gave the second sign. Normally calm and gentle, Scout enjoyed lying on the porch, watching the tree line with half-closed eyes. But that day, the dog refused to leave the porch at all. He kept staring into the woods with his fur slightly raised and a low, uneasy rumble in his throat. Even when Elaine tried to coax him down the steps, he backed away and pressed against her leg. That evening, as the sun lowered behind the trees, a slow, heavy exhale echoed from somewhere just beyond the clearing. It wasn't loud, but it carried a weight Thomas had never heard before, deep, chest-heavy, almost thoughtful. Elaine heard it too. She paused at the kitchen window and looked at her husband, who was already staring into the growing darkness. "What was that?" she asked quietly. Thomas didn't answer. He didn't know how to. They had lived among wildlife for decades, but this sound, this footprint, this shift in the dog's behavior, none of it felt familiar. None of it matched anything they had seen in those woods before. Still, neither of them were frightened, just aware, alert, and quietly waiting for whatever came next. That night, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Thomas and Elaine had finished dinner, cleaned the small kitchen, and settled into their worn chairs by the fireplace. Normally, the woods outside would hum with life at this hour. Crickets would chirp softly, owls would call in the distance, and the wind would rustle the tall pines in a comforting, familiar rhythm. But tonight, there was nothing. At first, it was subtle. A missing rustle here, a missing call there. Then it became complete. Total silence. Even Scout, their usually alert dog, seemed unusually still, his ears twitching but his body unmoving. Thomas pressed his hand against the window frame and felt a faint vibration beneath his feet, so slight that it could have been imagined, yet steady enough to be felt. "What is it?" Elaine whispered, her voice calm but tinged with unease. Thomas shook his head. "I don't know." They both stepped closer to the window, peering into the darkness. Shadows stretched and shifted among the trees, elongated by the thin moonlight. Something or several somethings moved slowly through the clearing. Not rushing, not aggressive, just present. They didn't run. They didn't call for help. Their life in the forest had taught them patience and caution. Instead, they stood quietly, letting their eyes adjust to the dim light, watching the shapes move with deliberate, careful steps. The shadows stopped just beyond the edge of the clearing. A tall figure stood still, observing the cabin. Then another, and another. Thomas counted 5 in total, tall, broad, their outlines unmistakable against the lighter undergrowth. Elaine's hand found his. They squeezed gently, neither of them speaking. For the first time in decades, the forest felt alive in a way they couldn't explain. Something old, something large, something intelligent was out there. And it was aware of them. They remained inside, watching silently, hearts steady but minds racing. The forest no longer seemed entirely theirs. Something new had arrived, something that would change the quiet rhythm of their lives forever. And they both knew it, whatever it was. It wasn't here by accident. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The night stretched slowly, each minute marked by the faint shifting of shadows in the clearing. Thomas and Elaine remained pressed against the window, their breathing steady, but their minds alert. They had lived in the forest for decades, and nothing, no storm, no wild animal had ever made their hearts beat like this. Then they saw it. A tall figure stepped fully into the moonlight. It was unlike any animal they had known. Broad-shouldered, covered in dark, thick fur, and moving with a surprising grace. Its head turned slowly toward the cabin, eyes catching a glint of silver in the moon. Thomas swallowed, holding Elaine's hand a little tighter. Then another appeared behind the first. And another. Soon, the clearing was filled with at least 5 figures, standing, observing, and forming a silent circle around the cabin. Their movements were deliberate, measured. There was no rush, no threat, just presence. Elaine's breath caught as she realized these were not ordinary creatures. They were intelligent, aware, and possibly communicating among themselves in a way the humans could not yet understand. One figure, taller than the others and older in appearance, stepped closer to the front. Its posture was upright, commanding, yet calm. It stopped, eyes locked on the cabin. And the couple felt something unspoken pass between them. Awareness, recognition, a quiet intelligence that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand straight. Thomas wanted to move, to reach for the rifle, to do something. But Elaine's gentle hand on his arm reminded him to stay still. They had learned in life that not all things unknown were dangerous. Sometimes observation was the wisest choice. Minutes passed. The figures did not advance further. They simply stood, silent and still, their eyes reflecting the pale moonlight. Then one, the elder, turned slightly and let out a low, soft sound. Not a growl, not a roar, just a note, almost like a question. Thomas and Elaine realized then that these creatures were not enemies. They were something else entirely. Something that belonged to the forest but was aware of them. Aware of their presence. And for the first time, they understood that the forest they had called home for decades had more life and more intelligence than they had ever imagined. Asterisk. The night stretched on, heavy with quiet. Thomas and Elaine stayed pressed to the window, careful not to make a sound. Outside, the figures moved subtly, shifting their weight from one massive foot to the other. There was no aggression, no fear, only observation, intense, thoughtful, and deliberate. Then something remarkable happened. One of the figures, slightly smaller, perhaps younger, stepped forward. In its hands, it held a small object, carefully wrapped in leaves. Without a word, it placed the bundle on the ground near the porch. Its movements were slow and deliberate, almost ceremonial. Thomas and Elaine's hearts thumped, but neither of them moved. They understood, instinctively, that any sudden motion could disturb this fragile moment. The creatures did not speak as humans do. There were no growls or calls that could be interpreted in words. Instead, they communicated with subtle gestures, tilts of the head, shifts in posture, and low, almost melodic sounds that seemed to vibrate in the clearing. Each movement carried meaning, though Thomas and Elaine could not fully understand it. The couple watched in silent awe as the elder figure nodded toward the smaller ones. And they, in turn, stepped back slightly, their eyes never leaving the cabin. It was clear that this was not an act of hostility, nor of mere curiosity. Something was being asked of them, though they could not yet grasp what. Thomas glanced at Elaine. Her wide eyes reflected the moonlight, filled with the same mixture of fear, wonder, and something softer compassion. He squeezed her hand lightly, and she squeezed back, silently agreeing to observe, to wait, to respect. The small object on the ground glimmered faintly in the pale light. They could feel the weight of the moment pressing in on them. It was more than a simple offering, it was a message. A request. A connection. And for the first time, they realized the forest's mysteries were not just about survival or danger. They were about understanding, about quiet communication, and about the fragile bridge that could exist between two very different worlds. For that night, Thomas and Elaine did not speak. They simply watched, their hearts open, their minds steady as the figures remained, patient and attentive, waiting for the humans to respond in their own quiet way. By the time the first rays of sunlight touched the treetops, Thomas and Elaine moved carefully toward the porch. The night's tension still lingered in the air, thick and quiet. The figures had vanished somewhere among the trees, leaving behind only the small object near the cabin's edge. Thomas bent down slowly, keeping his hands visible and his movements deliberate. He lifted the bundle wrapped in leaves. Inside, they found a small wooden figure, roughly carved but clearly made with care. Its shape resembled a tiny creature, upright, with arms slightly outstretched as if reaching for something or someone. The texture of the wood was worn smooth in places, evidence of repeated handling. Elaine's hand trembled slightly as she reached to touch it. It feels important," she whispered, her voice breaking the silence. Thomas nodded. "It does, but what does it mean?" Neither could answer. They only knew it was not meant to frighten them. There was something intimate about the gesture, a quiet communication from a being they could barely comprehend. The figure seemed to carry a story, a memory, a fragment of life far older and larger than themselves. As they examined it, they noticed faint markings etched along the baselines and patterns that were deliberate, meaningful, though impossible for them to read. Thomas realized with a sudden clarity that this was not just a toy or a random object. It belonged to one of the figures that had surrounded their cabin, somewhere deep in the forest. A family had lost one of their young. This figure was a symbol of that loss, a plea for acknowledgement, a bridge between their world and the humans who had unknowingly witnessed their grief. The couple felt a quiet, heavy sorrow settle over them. The forest had always been their home, a source of peace and comfort. But now, they understood it contained lives and emotions far beyond their understanding. They were not intruders, but witnesses to something sacred. Thomas set the figure gently on the porch railing, and Elaine knelt beside it, taking a deep breath. For a moment, the morning air seemed charged with meaning. The figure was small, fragile, yet carried a weight heavier than anything they had ever encountered. The forest had reached out to them, and they, for the first time, truly felt its heart. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the forest, Thomas and Elaine felt a quiet tension in the air. The morning had brought understanding, but now a sense of anticipation lingered. They watched from the cabin window as shadows moved slowly through the trees. It was the tribe. One by one, the tall figures emerged from the forest, moving with deliberate care. There was no rush, no fear, no aggression. Just a solemn presence that seemed almost reverent. Thomas and Elaine felt their hearts tighten, sensing that something important was about to happen. Among the figures, one stood out, a female. Slightly smaller, her movements careful, her posture heavy with sorrow. She carried something wrapped in broad leaves. The couple's breath caught. They could see her approach the cabin, placing the bundle gently on the ground. Thomas and Elaine stepped back, letting her do as she wished. They understood instinctively that this was not a threat. It was a moment of trust. The female Bigfoot carefully unwrapped the bundle. Inside lay a small, lifeless form, a young member of the tribe. The couple's eyes filled with tears, though they did not make a sound. The mother's grief was quiet but overwhelming. Her low, trembling hum echoed softly through the clearing, a sound that carried pain, love, and loss all at once. The elder figure nodded toward the couple, almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging their presence and granting them permission to witness this moment. The tribe remained nearby, silent, respectful, forming a loose circle around the small body. Thomas and Elaine felt an unspoken connection, a fragile bridge between their world and the creature's sorrow. They could sense the depth of the tribe's grief, their need for closure, and their desire to honor their young. Neither human nor creature moved hastily. The air was heavy with emotion, calm but intense. Every gesture, every step was deliberate, meaningful. For the first time, the couple realized that these beings, so large and wild, were capable of love and mourning just as humans were. The forest was not merely a place of life and danger. It was a home to beings with hearts, families, and rituals. That night, Thomas and Elaine understood something profound. The forest had shared its secret with them, and they would never forget the weight of that trust. Thomas and Elaine stepped outside the next morning with slow, deliberate movements. The forest was quiet, but it felt alive in a different way, tense, yet sacred. The small form of the young Bigfoot remained in the clearing, surrounded by the solemn figures of the tribe. The humans approached carefully, not to disturb the delicate balance of this grieving ritual. Thomas knelt and began to clear a small area beneath a tall pine tree, selecting a spot that felt calm and sheltered. Elaine gathered loose stones and wildflowers, arranging them nearby with quiet care. They worked in silence, understanding that every action mattered to the tribe watching them. The mother Bigfoot crouched a short distance away, eyes fixed on the preparations. She made a low, trembling hum, a sound filled with sorrow and trust. The elder stood slightly behind her, observing Thomas and Elaine with an intensity that was almost reverent. The couple felt a weight pressing gently on their hearts, a responsibility far greater than any ordinary human task. Gently, Thomas lifted the small body, handling it with utmost care. The mother Bigfoot extended her hand slightly, and Thomas lowered the form toward the ground. She touched it lightly, her fingers brushing the fur with tenderness and grief. Elaine placed the first wildflowers around the small mound, and the mother echoed her gesture with small pieces of greenery from the forest floor. The tribe moved slowly, each member participating in their own quiet way. Stones were placed, leaves arranged, and soft hums filled the space like a song of farewell. The humans did not speak, understanding that words would only break the sacred silence. Minutes passed, stretching into a timeless moment. The grief, love, and respect were palpable, connecting human and creature in a way neither could have imagined. The couple realized that they were part of something far older than themselves, an ancient rhythm of life and loss that transcended species. Finally, the mother straightened and stepped back. The elder nodded toward Thomas and Elaine, a gesture of recognition, gratitude, and trust. The ritual was complete. The mound was simple, yet perfect, a resting place filled with care, attention, and profound respect. Thomas and Elaine stood side by side, hearts heavy but humbled. The forest had revealed its deepest truths to them that day. Even in its wildest, most untamed corners, life mourned, loved, and honored its own. And now, humans and Bigfoot shared that truth together, in silent, unspoken understanding. After the burial, Thomas and Elaine stepped back to give the tribe space. The air was heavy with the quiet hum of mourning, yet it carried something more, something gentle, almost like a blessing. The figures moved slowly, deliberately, circling the small mound they had helped prepare. The mother crouched beside it, brushing the soil lightly with her large, careful hands. She let out a soft, low sound that carried both sorrow and relief, a note that seemed to tell the humans, "Thank you." The elder Bigfoot stood behind her, watching the couple with eyes that conveyed something deeper than words: trust, acknowledgement, and a quiet appreciation for their participation. One by one, the tribe approached the grave. Each placed something symbolic upon it: a smooth stone carefully selected from the forest floor, a small bundle of berries gathered from the nearby bushes, a strand of fur from themselves, pressed gently against the mound. Every gesture was deliberate, imbued with meaning, and offered without expectation. Thomas and Elaine remained still, understanding that this was not just an act of mourning, it was a ritual of closure, a way for the tribe to honor what had been lost. Each movement, each soft hum, each gaze toward the humans carried layers of significance they could not fully understand, but felt profoundly. The mother straightened at last, her gaze lingering on the couple. She took a step back and let the wind carry a low, harmonic sound through the clearing. The elder made a small nod, a bow of recognition toward Thomas and Elaine. It was a gesture of thanks, of acknowledgement, of connection. Then, slowly, the tribe began to retreat into the forest. They moved with the same deliberate care that had marked every action of the evening. Before they disappeared entirely, the mother lingered for a brief moment, placing her hand lightly on a carved branch Thomas had found the day before, a subtle, silent gift of trust. When the last figure vanished among the trees, the couple remained at the clearing's edge, hearts heavy yet strangely uplifted. They had witnessed grief, compassion, and ritual in a way they never could have imagined. The forest was quiet once more, but it no longer felt ordinary. It had revealed its depth, its intelligence, and its capacity for love. And in that quiet, Thomas and Elaine understood something profoundly simple. Some connections transcend species, words, and worlds, and they are recognized in silence. The morning after the burial, the forest felt different. Sunlight poured through the tall pines, casting long, gentle shadows across the clearing. Birds had returned to their calls, and the soft rustle of leaves filled the air once more. But Thomas and Elaine noticed something they hadn't before: a quiet sense of presence, subtle but unmistakable, as if the forest itself carried the memory of the night before. They stepped outside, moving slowly. The mound beneath the pine tree was undisturbed, the stones and wildflowers arranged with care, the small carved objects still resting nearby. Thomas knelt and brushed his hand lightly over the surface, feeling the texture of the soil, the smoothness of the stones. Elaine placed a few additional wildflowers at the edges, a gesture of quiet respect. For a moment, neither spoke. They simply observed the stillness around them, feeling the weight of what had transpired. The forest, once familiar and ordinary, now seemed alive with a presence they could feel but not see. Scout, their dog, sniffed gently around the mound, then rested his head calmly at their feet. It was as if even he recognized the significance of the place. Thomas glanced at Elaine and nodded slightly. "They trusted us," he said softly. "They let us be part of something important." Elaine's eyes filled with quiet tears. "And we didn't do anything wrong. We only watched. We only cared." The couple remained there for several minutes, absorbing the peace that followed the grief. The forest had shown them a rare and sacred truth: life and loss, no matter the form, deserved respect. And for the first time in decades, Thomas and Elaine felt fully connected, not just to the forest around them, but to the unseen lives within it. They understood that some bonds, once formed, leave a permanent mark on the heart. The morning air was crisp and still, carrying a quiet promise: the forest would remember. And so would they. In the quiet that followed, Thomas and Elaine returned to their cabin, carrying with them a sense of calm they had never experienced before. The forest had revealed a secret that was both fragile and profound. It had shown them that life, even in its wildest and most mysterious forms, shared emotions and bonds as deep as those of humans. They sat together by the fireplace, sipping their morning coffee, letting the warmth spread through their hands. The images of the tribe's gentle mourning, the careful placement of stones and wildflowers, and the quiet gestures of trust lingered vividly in their minds. It was a memory that demanded neither explanation nor words, only understanding and respect. Elaine broke the silence softly. "They trusted us, even though we are human." Thomas nodded, his gaze distant. "Yes, and we honored that trust, just by watching, by caring, by being present." It struck them both how rare such moments were. A connection had been formed that transcended language, species, and worlds. The forest had entrusted them with something sacred, a glimpse into the hearts of beings they had once considered only legends. They understood now that fear had no place here. What they had witnessed was not danger, but vulnerability, grief, love, a family honoring its own, asking for acknowledgement, and finding it in the most unlikely of companions. The couple knew they would never speak of this to anyone else. Some truths are too delicate, too precious for casual telling. The forest, the tribe, and their shared experience would remain theirs alone. And that secrecy felt like part of the bond itself, a quiet promise to protect what had been entrusted to them. Thomas and Elaine leaned back in their chairs, feeling the steady rhythm of life returning to the forest. The shadows of the trees seemed warmer, the wind softer, and the air full of something unspoken, but deeply felt. In that moment, they understood the simplest, yet most profound lesson the forest could offer: not all connections are visible, and not all love is spoken. Some of it exists quietly, across worlds, in the trust we honor and the respect we give.